Hola a todos, buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches, dependiendo de la parte del globo terráqueo desde donde os conectéis. Estamos en el curso seminario El mundo después de la pandemia, organizado por la Academia de Pensamiento Crítico y la Fundación de Investigaciones Marxistas. Estamos precisamente en el eje temático Mundo Multipolar y Declive Imperial, y nos encontramos con John Bellamy Foster, que es profesor de la Universidad de Oregon, Estados Unidos, y editor de la revista Monthly Review. Y la ponencia que nos va a dar va a ser titulada Capitalismo, verde o Eco-socialismo. Well, now in English, this is the course seminar, The World After the Pandemic, organized by the Academy of Critical Thought at the Marxist Research Foundation. Thematic axis is multipolar world and imperial decline. And the keynote speaker today is John Bellamy Foster, professor at the University of Oregon, USA, and editor of Monthly Review magazine. The talk is titled Green Capitalism or Eco-socialism. Well, welcome, John, and you can go ahead with your talking. Thank you.
Hello, I was asked to speak on the question of green capitalism or eco-socialism. And one often hears today about green capitalism. Clearly, this is not something that exists at present. We are in the midst of planetary ecological crisis generated by the capitalist relations of production. Nevertheless, it's often argued that a green capitalism will solve our serious, even catastrophe-threatening environmental problems. And historically, this makes very little sense. There's absolutely no basis from an historical standpoint for thinking that green capitalism is in any meaningful sense possible, and quite the contrary. If we look at capitalism over the last 500 plus years, it has been a story of growing war on the environment that has now reached the point that every ecosystem in the world is threatened with destruction and decline. And the planet itself is being undermined as a safe home for humanity. So that our entire Earth system, as we call it, as science calls it, has been compromised and is being more compromised every year. To give one obvious example of the problem, we've known about accelerated global warming for about 80 years, since the early 1960s, and yet no real attempts have been made thus far to prevent it, despite a lot of talk, with emissions still rapidly increasing, so that we are in fact speeding towards the cliff's edge, or to change the metaphor, breaking the carbon budget. We are already in a phase of dangerous climate change and are facing within a generation at the present level of carbon emissions, very dangerous climate change, which may well prove irreversible. The science says that we have to reduce carbon emissions globally by something like about 40% by 2030, and we have to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And as you must be aware, this is a very difficult thing to accomplish. It can't be accomplished without a complete revolution. There's no other word for it in our production systems. Today's youth will be left, if we don't address this problem, today's youth will be left with a planet that is no longer a safe place for humanity. those people who are in their 20s now could conceivably expect to live out most of this century. But the science tells us that we are facing catastrophe in this century if we don't make very rapid shifts. Now, capitalism can be defined as a historical social system geared to capital accumulation ad infinitum. It's not really, capitalism isn't really about markets, although that's an element of a capitalist system. The crucial thing is to understand capitalism's drive to accumulation that arises out of its institutional framework. It is the drive to accumulate capital or exponential economic growth, which constitutes the defining characteristic of capitalism as a socioeconomic system rooted in class-based commodity production with this law of accumulation, this drive to accumulation enforced by competitive market relations. In such a system, the rule is that the economy must grow or die. The United States currently has a $21 trillion economy. For capitalism to work in the United States, it has to produce in the next year a $21 trillion economy again, plus a certain net value added, say of an additional 3%, which allows for profits and new capital formation. And the same process has to occur year after year, regardless of what it is that's being produced, how it is being produced, under what conditions, or for whom. The point of capitalism is this incremental exponential growth. So the system can never stand still. It always has to increase. And it often increases by means of waste and destruction of the natural world and human life. The increase is not necessarily a gain in terms of human life or the planet, as we can well see today. A 3% rate of growth, which today is rarely attained, but is considered the level needed for a capitalist economy to function effectively, is itself a threat to the environment. If you have a continuous 3% rate of growth, the economy will increase, the size of the economy will increase by 16 times in a century. It will increase by 250 times in 2 centuries, and by 4,000 times in 3 centuries. That is going back, if we think in terms of 3 centuries from now, with a 3% rate of growth, the world economy would be 4,000 times as big as it is now. In standard or neoclassical economics, such a path of growth is generally assumed to be natural, inevitable, and unavoidable. But it does not take a mathematician or a physicist to tell you that to increase the economy by 16, 250, or 4,000 times within a given Earth system, and one that is already in jeopardy due to the scale and destructiveness of the capitalist economy, is an absurd undertaking. Climate change is only one of the 9 planetary boundaries defining the Earth as a safe place for humanity that scientists have designated, and that we are crossing or in danger of crossing due to anthropogenic causes. This is very important to understand. Climate change is not our only global ecological crisis. We have others that are going on simultaneously, all of which are related to climate change, but cannot be reduced to climate change. That is, they operate on their own. So the other global ecological crises, the other planetary boundaries that we're crossing, include loss of biodiversity and species extinction, ocean acidification, destruction of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, loss of forest and ground cover, and loss of fresh water, also growing chemical toxicity and radioactivity. And to these, we can add new pandemics arising from human action, as we've seen with COVID-19. The only planetary boundary that we've been able to address fairly effectively is the destruction of the ozone layer, because it had a fairly simple technical solution. But none of these other problems can be addressed in that way. Each one of these planetary boundaries represents a global ecological crisis threatening humanity. They all have one common denominator: the expansive and Earth system breaking tendencies of the capitalist order. Ocean acidification, for example, has been associated with the great die-downs in Earth history, the earlier Earth extinctions prior to our present one, the sixth extinction, as it's called, caused by humanity. And the ocean acidification, which is also caused by carbon emissions, is as serious as climate change itself. Karl Marx famously explained the labor and production process, explained that the labor and production process conceived in the broadest sense constituted the metabolism mediating between human beings and nature. Capitalism severs this metabolism in every way, creating what Marx called a metabolic rift, or a irreparable rift in the interdependent social metabolism between humanity and nature. And the way this metabolic rift comes about is through basically the robbery of nature, the expropriation of nature by the system in its drive for accumulation without any consideration of the requirements of reciprocity in natural systems, instead reducing everything to a simple cash nexus in the search of ever greater acquisition of wealth. At the same time, the increasing scale of the capital system resulting from the uncontrolled accumulation of capital has come to rival the biogeochemical cycles of the planet itself, of the Earth system itself. So if you had one car going around, driving around on the Earth, releasing carbon dioxide, it wouldn't be a significant event. It wouldn't mean anything, because carbon dioxide is part of the natural system, part of the atmosphere, part of our own respiratory system. But when you have millions and billions of cars driving trillions of miles, all emitting carbon from carbon dioxide, then the scale of the carbon dioxide emitted in this way comes to rival the biogeochemical cycles of the planet. The entire carbon cycle is affected, and we see an anthropogenic rift in the Earth system, which crosses critical thresholds and creates systemic crises, ecological crises in the Earth system. And this is what is happening. This is how we understand the current geological epoch of the Anthropocene, semi-officially designated as such by science today. But what about technology in the market? Can't they achieve wonders? Isn't the capitalist system of private accumulation the most technologically innovative system ever developed? Isn't the market the most efficient economic system ever developed? can't they solve the environmental problem? It's true that it is impossible to address today's planetary ecological crisis without a change in the technological infrastructure of production and consumption. In this respect, it is necessary to shift massively to alternative, non-carbon emitting energy systems. It is necessary to, in fact, to keep fossil fuels in the ground and replace them with energy sources that do not contribute to global warming, such as solar and wind power. This has been known for many decades. However, this has not been happening. Although there is growth of solar and wind power, which advocates of green capitalism will point to, these forms of energy have not so far displaced fossil fuels at all, but have simply supplemented the fossil fuel economy, which has remained intact. The leading scientific article on this is appeared in Nature Climate Change a few years ago by Richard York, demonstrating this empirically, so that so far we haven't succeeded at all in replacing fossil fuel energy with solar and wind power. In the 1860s, the economist William Stanley Jevons introduced what we now call the Jevons paradox in a book called The Coal Question. Jevons pointed out that even though each new steam engine was more efficient than the one before, that is, required less input of coal to produce greater steam power. Even though each new steam engine was more efficient than the one before, the system kept on consuming more coal. The increased efficiency did not go to conservation. The increased efficiency went to the increase in scale, more steam engines, larger steam engines, and so on. And this is actually, although Jevons didn't understand it or explain it that way, is a product of the capitalist system, because the goal of the system is not to conserve. As Hannah Arendt once said, conservation is anathema to the capitalist system. The goal of the system is not to conserve, but to accumulate, which requires an increase in scale, greater throughput of energy and materials in order to increase production, in order to increase consumption, and expand the entire system. And so all gains in efficiency are used to increase the scale of the system and increase the consumption of energy. And although we're more efficient in producing energy, we can see it, we're always more efficient. We become more efficient with each year for the last 200 years. We always increase our use of energy, and the scale effects override the conservation effects, which is a crucial problem. And the technology that we adopt is designed to promote accumulation, to service the needs of capital within a class-based system, to increase exploitation, to increase accumulation, to increase scale. None of the technology that we use or its implementation is really oriented to actual conservation. One thing that Jevons said is that the most efficient steam engine from the standpoint of conservation was the very first steam engine, because it didn't work, and so it didn't it conserved coal by not using it. We can also look at the Lauderdale paradox, named after the Earl of Lauderdale in the late 18th century, who was a thinker about the time of Adam Smith, and a major political economist. The Lauderdale paradox is useful in terms of understanding the problem of markets. Lauderdale explained that the purpose of a capitalist economy is not the production of use values or the preservation and promotion of public wealth, that is real wealth in material terms for people in general, that would benefit people in general. Rather, the capitalist system is aimed at the promotion of exchange value or money, capital accumulation for the benefit of a relatively few. This means that capitalism tends to expropriate and privatize public wealth, such as the natural commons or the social commons that existed in the feudal era and early capitalist era. It expropriates everything that belongs to the public, everything that can be considered the commons, including water resources, air, etc., which by rights belong to all. And instead, capitalism tends to privatize these, destroy these forms of public wealth, create scarcity, because scarcity is necessary in order to monopolize the commons, to monopolize public wealth, and to turn it into private markets that can induce exchange value and accumulation for capital. So capital destroys the capital and its private markets, destroys everything that's in common. It expropriates everything that's in common, everything that's public wealth. Lauderdale had all sorts of examples, like the way in which, the common way in which if too much food is produced by the standards of the market so that the price will fall, capital will burn crops and burn the food to reinforce scarcity rather than to provide the food to the populations that are hungry. The capital, he argued, if it can monopolize and privatize water, which is a necessity of human existence, then it can charge prices for this. It can charge people for fresh water, which is a necessity of human existence. And we see this developing in our time. This tells us how markets, private markets, are actually destructive of public wealth of the commons in a systematic way. The destruction of the atmosphere is thus not a tragedy for capital, but rather creates scarcities and new bases of accumulation, like carbon trading. The capital treats nature as a free gift, a term common in classical political economy. Everything that nature provides is treated as a free gift to be monopolized by the owners. But this ensures a system that doesn't cover the needs of sustaining nature, the needs of reciprocity, and that simply expropriates nature and natural resources and the commons for the purpose of accumulation, and doesn't internalize the environmental damage. Rather, the environmental costs are externalized, as they say in economics, on humanity and nature as a whole. So markets are actually very destructive of the environment. They markets under capitalist system, all economies have to have some kinds of markets, but a market in a capitalist system is almost inherently destructive of the environment because it's concerned simply with private accumulation and use value, and not with public wealth, public good, the earth system, etc. But what if a far-sighted CEO, a corporate executive, the head of a multinational corporation, decided to change all of this and say that he or she would put the environment first instead of profits? In the capitalist system and in the legal framework of the capitalist system, that CEO could say, well, we're going to green capitalism, we're going to put the environment first. And as long as they just simply said it, like they do sometimes, it would be okay. As long as the investors knew they were lying to the public, everything would be fine. But if a CEO tried to implement that, they would be accused of, they would be actually prosecuted for betraying their fiduciary responsibility, which in this system requires that they put the welfare, that is the stockholders' value, the value of the stockholders and profits, ahead of all other things. They would be breaking their fiduciary responsibility. They could be arrested and put in jail under this system, simply for putting the environment before profits. That's the way the system works. The system says, well, we'll help clean up the environment, but we have to put profits and accumulation always first. But the putting profits and accumulation always first means that the environment is always second or third, and their green capitalism becomes an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. Why can't we shift from a fossil fuel economy? Why are we having so much trouble switching from a fossil fuel economy in the capitalist system? Well, one of the reasons is the financial nature of the system. So that all of the fossil fuels, there are fossil fuels, trillions of dollars worth of fossil fuels that are owned by private corporations, multinational corporations, in some cases by state entities that are underground, but are considered the assets of those corporations. And those trillions of dollars of assets, below ground assets, the fossil fuel reserves, which corporations own, underwrite the financial structure of the corporations, underwrite their accumulation. If they stopped burning fossil fuels, or stopped selling fossil fuels to be burned, and saying there will be no more burning of fossil fuels, all those trillions of dollars in assets underground would be lost to those corporations. So they have to insist that they're going to burn all the fossil fuels, and they have to continue burning them to make good those trillions of dollars of assets. So it's extremely difficult under this system. Why if as we know, solar energy and wind power solar power and wind power are actually cheaper than fossil fuels. In many cases, why are we not displacing fossil fuels with solar and wind power? Well, the problem is that we have this giant fossil fuel infrastructure all over the planet, which we are expanding. The US in the last few years and Canada have been expanding their infrastructure for fossil fuels, their pipelines, et cetera, spending $3 trillion on this, expanding the infrastructure. That infrastructure is the biggest infrastructure of any kind on the entire planet. And what makes fossil fuels economical in these situations is the existence of that infrastructure where there is no solar and wind power infrastructure. So we have to replace one infrastructure with another, and that's costly. Meanwhile, if you can just use the fossil fuels based on the existing infrastructure, that is at present more profitable. So it's all determined by the system of accumulation and profit. We have to change the rules, but we can only change the rules by going against the logic of capital, by building movements that are essentially socialist movements because they go against the logic of capital, or anti-capitalist movements, forcing the system away from its own logic, its own law of value, imposing on it requirements, and ultimately his system will have to be transformed and transcended. We'll have to create a new social, economic, ecological order. But in terms of climate change, we only have about a generation. We have longer if we really start cutting, but it's where we have a shortage of time, and we have to start from where we are. And that is that within a capitalist system, we have to go against the logic of the capitalist system, at least in the realm of fossil fuels. We have to go after fossil capital. We have to go after the financial system that undergirds it. We have to push in another direction. And that's what eco-socialism is all about. We need an ecological revolution. And the term revolution is appropriate here because we're talking about a scale of change that is greater and more rapid than humanity has ever experienced, ever carried out before. And it has to be done on social and ecological principles that go against the logic of the present system. So it has to be a revolution, whether that revolution involves violence, extreme social conflict, and so on. No doubt it will, but that's not the essence of the problem. The essence of the problem is that for human survival, or at least the survival of civilization, and to save the lives of hundreds of millions of people, we have to change the system, and we have to change it rapidly. And we have to combine that with all of the best social values, with a whole other set of principles that are opposed to those of capitalism. What we need is eco-socialism, which I think and any really meaningful socialism has to be ecological. We need eco-socialism. We need an ecological civilization. It has to be a society rooted on substantive equality. That is equality all the way down, and the equality encompassing society and principles of ecological sustainability. That's the kind of society we need. In terms of socialism, Marx argued that we need a society where the associated producers, that is, the working people, the actual producers, direct producers in society, need to control society and to be able to rationally regulate the metabolism between nature and society, metabolism via production between nature and society, in order to promote. In order to conserve energy and promote sustainable human development. This is a paraphrase of a famous definition of the most famous definition of socialism offered by Marx in volume 3 of Capital. But Robert Heilbrunner, in a book called Capitalism, or the book called 21st Century Capitalism, said it maybe most simply. He said that socialism, and he meant an ecological socialism. Socialism is a society that is no longer governed by economic determinism. It's an irony. Marxism is often accused of economic determinism, but socialism, Marxism has always been concerned primarily with enhancing the material and conditions and possibilities of human beings in all facets of life, and opposed to the narrow logic of accumulation that we associate with economics under capitalism. And so what we need is a socialism that brings other values to the fore, that rejects the economic determinism built into the capitalist system via its accumulation process, its one-dimensional focus on capital accumulation, and a society that is based on substantive equality and ecological sustainability, a system of sustainable human development that allows for the fullest development of human culture, and eliminates, and this is critical to this whole problem, the imperialism between North and South that is probably the greatest liability of the present system, in the sense that it is this imperial divide that is capitalism's greatest weapon against humanity. And we have to eliminate that as well in a process of creating an ecological system in a form of sustainable human development. There is really no other way. There is no other alternative. It's a question, as Marx and Engels said at different times, it's a question of